Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-365. Today's episode we'll be covering how to run automations leveraging something known as the secure application model from Microsoft. Now, a lot of us running automations today are typically leveraging something like PowerShell, and with PowerShell you have your terminal window here, and effectively what you're doing is authenticating to whatever modules, and in a lot of cases that might be the graph modules. In previous lifetimes now, with everything kind of going legacy, it was the Azure AD modules, MS Online, things like that. The basic premise here though, behind the scenes of what's going on, is you're tapping into the direct APIs from Microsoft, and whenever you authenticate, you're basically getting an access token in order to perform and run those commandlets as part of that automation. So now when we talk about automation, we want to have something that's known as headless automation for running scripts on a periodic basis or without having to sign in. So basically just having enough of the rights that we need to be able to perform these automations, again, without having to have to sit in front of a terminal and actually authenticate. So when we talk about this, we're talking about a automation capability, again, that's known as a secure application model. And this all starts within our Azure AD or Entra ID tenant. Whenever we make these automations, or we want to call these automations, we want to have an identity to tie that back to. And so the secure application model is built to tie this to an identity that's not associated with a user record, and can also be scoped for least privileged access. So when we talk about that, when we create a service principal, or app registration as better known, I'll be showing you how to do this within the Entra portal as we keep going here. But this is an identity within the Entra ID admin center, and basically here you are able to go in and scope what permissions or what endpoints within the Graph API from Microsoft that this could hit. So that might be users, that might be devices, and that might be something like groups, for instance. It could be also SharePoint sites. It could be things like tapping into the policies that you have within the environment as well. So all these things kind of fold up into what you're granting. But notice here that I'm scoping it to the permissions that I need. I'm not giving it blanket level permissions across the entire ecosystem. So again, least privileged model here that we're looking at doing. So whenever you set this up, you then are going through a process here to go ahead and get what's known as a refresh token. And the refresh token is effectively what allows you to leverage a script or process to grab what's known also as an access token, which you can use to pass in and call Microsoft Graph APIs in your tenant for specific endpoints that you want to hit. So when we talk about this, there's a couple of things that need to go on. And with this, when we talk about the secure application model, there's a few things that we get whenever we set up this service principal. One of which is a client ID or application ID. This is basically just the ID of the service principal or that app registration. The other thing that we're getting from this is a client secret. So this could be a GUID based value. This could also just be a certificate that you set up to help pass through for the authentication. And the example that I'm going to show with you today, I'm going to be showing you how to do this with a GUID based value that's good for 6 months, and then you have to roll that moving forward. So again, another secure practice is to keep rolling your passwords. In this case, we're talking about doing this with the secret here. And all of this that I'm mentioning here is again beneficial because to run anything headless, like what we've done in the past, is we've used basic authentication, meaning we have a username and a password. Now, and all across the ecosystem, Microsoft's enforced multi-factor authentication to be able to log in, which means we need another method. We need to still have security based by that, but we need another method to authenticate. So whenever we're talking about this model in general, the other thing that we're going to get is our tenant ID, because this is what we're going to use to grab and create a link that we're going to use to accept to grab the refresh tokens and the access tokens authorization code, which I'll get to here in a minute. And then the final thing we're looking to pass in from the standpoint of just generating these tokens is what's known as scope. So in most cases, or in this use case that I'm going to show for you today, the scope is going to be around Microsoft Graph, so that we can grab Microsoft Graph APIs. But other scopes that might be applicable to you might be something like Partner Center, for instance, if you want to get an access token into Partner Center. So from here, what we're doing here is a couple of steps to grant ourselves rights within this environment, just so we can get the access token, refresh token as well too. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to leverage these key factors as far as the client ID, client ID secret, the tenant ID, and the scope in order to get what's known as an authorization code. So basically, whenever you get the authorization code, you're going to bundle this into a URL that you can authenticate to in your browser. And just note that when you're authenticating here, this needs to have a user that can accept or grant rights for the particular application on behalf of the organization. And a lot of times that's going to be a global administrator within the tenant. And the other key piece here is that this user does have to have Microsoft MFA enabled. So it can't be a third party like Duo or anything like that. The hash that we pass over for the token has to have the MFA grant associated with it as well too. So with this in mind, we get this authentication code, and then the next thing that we're going to be doing here is we're going to be going in and leveraging that code in order to get a refresh token. And again, I'll show you this on the video in a more programmatic fashion, but it's basically just going to show you how to grab this refresh token. And this refresh token is good for 90 days. And this is what allows you to constantly get another access token as well. And the access token is ultimately what we're using here to authenticate in a headless fashion and run Graph APIs to run automations in our tenant. So the biggest thing here too, the default time to live here on the access token is about 1 hour. So that's where you would use the refresh token again in order to grant yourself another access token. So this is basically saying that I can set up this method, I can authenticate, and my session will be good for the refresh token for that amount of time. But it's also making sure that I'm constantly getting a new access token. Again, we don't want our access tokens to be perpetual or persist indefinitely, because that opens up security holes. So when we talk about our model here and the secrets, the refresh token and your client ID and client secret, mostly the client secret, are things that you should store in a very secure location. So that might be your documentation tools like IT Glue or Hoodoo, but it also might be an Azure Key Vault if you're just leveraging that as well too. But effectively, once we have this here, we are able to roll. We don't need, because we have a refresh token and an access token, we don't need to re-authenticate with the user in a terminal window or in the browser in order to keep rolling our tokens for the access rights that we do need. So from here, as an example, what you would do is you would make a HTTP request, and this isn't the exact URL, but I just want to make an example here. Let's say we want to get all of our users within the Microsoft tenant. We would then, make this particular endpoint request, and we would pass in our access token as part of the header information of this request. So effectively here, we're saying we have the rights in order to call this. Otherwise, you would get, a permissions error, 403, something like that when you try to make this request. And all of this, what we're doing here is allowing you to securely authenticate, but also, again, we have a model of least privilege when we talk about the APIs that have been scoped for this particular identity that we're leveraging in order to call these Graph APIs. So this is effectively what you can do to perform headless authentication. You can put this into certain automation capabilities, like I use a lot of Power Automate, and you can do this. I call from Key Vault to grab certain secrets that we need to basically get another access token and then perform some type of authentication. And Microsoft, if you're leveraging other automations, is doing this behind the scenes as well too. So with all that being said, let's pop into the Entra ID Admin Center just so I can see you or show you guys more of this firsthand, and then we'll actually call a PowerShell script leveraging the Graph API endpoints so you can see this in action as well. Okay, so before we get into it here, this is the output of what we're going to do here. This is a simple script that I wrote here to grab licensing within the Microsoft tenant. We are using these two Graph API endpoints here. One to grab our active subscriptions. This call gets us our renewal dates within CE. And then this other one here gets us the assign versus consume data that I like to see when it relates to license sprawl reporting, those types of things as well. And this is the output of that script as well too, which is just an HTML file that gets stored, and we are able to see the licensing within a tenant, any unused licensing, the renewal dates within CE, and then days till renewal, as well as if it's a trial or not. So it's a simple script again, but we want to leverage the secure application model and call Graph APIs leveraging the access token that we get through going through this process. So within the Entra Admin Center here, you can go under Applications and click on App Registrations. Now again, I use the term App Registration Service Principal in the same manner in this video because that's effectively what we're doing here. So within there, I'm going to go ahead and create a new registration, and I'm just going to call this Test Automation 1. What I would recommend is that you keep this without any spaces. I won't go into the unique details around that, but effectively, it can be leveraged for multi-tenancy. I have a whole nother blog post on that you could check out in video. In this use case though, we're going to do this for a single tenant. So we're just setting up this automation to run against my own tenant, not necessarily against other platforms. Under the redirect URI, you want to select web from the drop down there, and then typically I put in some localhost environment with an IP address of anything you really want here. Honestly, that's an open port on your device. I just use 8400 in this use case. Then after we're done here, we can go ahead and click on register. So after we're done here, you can take note of a couple different things. One of which is that we have our client ID here, or application ID that's listed. This is really public, and this is again a unique identifier for the service principal or app registration. And then we have our tenant ID here, which is related to my internal organization. And I'm not blurring this out because these are publicly available if you search for somebody's domain name, and you can grab that really easily. So the main thing is keeping your secrets non-exposed or hidden as well too. So one of the first things you would do is go into certificates and secrets. And what we're doing here is we're simply just creating a new client secret. Now, you can give this a description of whatever you like, and then you can define the expiration date. By default, it's going to recommend 6 months. This used to be indefinite, but this is something that you can define at a granular level here if you wanted to even do custom. But again, best practice here is that you're rolling the secret just as a best security practice. So I'm going to go ahead and click on add here. I will be deleting this application after we're done here, so, and you can't even see the full value, but what you want to do here is copy this value. The secret ID is not necessarily as necessary, but the value is really what we're going to be leveraging here. And effectively what we are going to be doing after we leave this page is we can't actually see this value either after that's done. So it's very important that you copy this and store it in a temporary location for right now. And like I mentioned earlier, you do want to store this in a very secure location like your documentation tool or within your Azure Key Vault if you have that spun up. So the other thing that we need to do here as far as running this automation is looking into the API permissions. Now this is again where I touched on in the video. You can define what rights and what API endpoints that you want to call. And so within here, you can add permissions and you can scope this. And in a lot of cases, you will be scoping to Microsoft Graph. But in some cases, you might also be consenting to Exchange because they have a different module for that. It's outside the scope of this video. But as you can see, they have other services in here. But Graph API is really where you're going to spend a lot of your time, in my opinion. And this is where you can see all of the individual permissions. Now, this might not make a lot of sense for you as far as all the granularity of it all, but whenever you're running your automations, you just follow Microsoft's API documentation to be able to determine what permissions you would need to scope to be able to call that API. I'll link this in the video, but this is Microsoft's Graph API documentation. You have the beta version and you have version 1.0. But this is your endpoints that you could potentially tap into, and this is your source of truth for the permissions that you would want to scope to that particular service principal. And in this case, if I go to one of the endpoints like list users here, we can see our permissions and we can see which ones are needed for the delegated versus application. And I'm not going to get into that as well just because it goes down a larger rabbit hole, but in a lot of cases, I would try to stick with delegated permissions that you have within the tenant. If this is a single tenant application, it's not as big of a concern. But again, we want the underlying fundamental value here is to scope it for least permissions of what you need to do. So this is one where we have user read basic all as a value for this as well too. So if I go back to my app registration, I could just simply paste that value in here without any white space, and then it would pull up this permission, and subsequently I can grant that permission, add it here, and then the only thing you may have to do for some is grant consent for your organization, which is basically just saying that you've approved this. And in order to do that, as you see the status in here, you do have to be someone of a privileged role, like a global admin. You could be an application administrator within the tenant as well too, to be able to do that. But this is basically, kind of going through that process. So this will look different as far as what permissions are on this page, depending on what you're looking to do. But again, for the API calls that I'm going to make later, I would need more permissions in order to do so. So I would just reference those API documentation specs for each one of those endpoints. Now on my blog, I do have all of these steps outlined as well too, so you don't have to necessarily be writing these things down. But then the step that we're on right now is getting a refresh token. And so I provided a script here that allows you to get both an access token, that will be good for an hour, and a refresh token that will be good for 90 days here. And you simply just have to modify, these values up at the top here. So if I copy this, I can open up PowerShell ISC. And from here, I can paste this in as well too. And you simply can paste in your client ID, your client secret, and your tenant ID. And that's what we're going to use in order to run this particular script. Now, if I open up PowerShell and I go ahead and paste this script in here, again, this is another app registration I'm going to delete after this video. But effectively here, we're just going through and we're defining a URL that we're going to consent to here. And it's dynamically passing in our client ID, our tenant ID, our redirect URI as well too, in order for us to be able to get an authorization code. So let's go ahead and hit enter here, and we'll go ahead and run this script. Now, when you do, you're going to be asked to sign in. Again, this is where you need a privileged administrator like a global admin or application administrator to consent. And they also have to have MFA enabled, Microsoft's MFA. So once you do that, you're going to get this refuse to connect here because you're running the redirect URI of that local host with the port value that you have on there as well too. But what you can do here is in the URL is grab this code as part of the parameters here. So what I'd like to do is just copy the whole URL, open up Notepad, paste this in, and then you'll see here that you have the whole value, but there is an additional parameter here, which is session state. So that's another parameter that we do not want. But we'll just go ahead and copy this particular endpoint here, or parameter I should say, which is the code. I'll pop back into PowerShell and I'll just paste this in here and I'll hit enter. And then from here, I do have an access token that's granted and my refresh token. So the refresh token, again, is very important that you store in a secret location just because it is going to give you the ability to refresh your access tokens, if that makes sense, so that you can call these graph APIs. Now, if we go back to our documentation here, as far as the blog post, I mentioned the session, mentioned the tokens that you get here. Now, we got an access token, but again, that's only going to be good for an hour, and then we'll need to get another one. So I wrote this script in here as well too that you can leverage, which basically is just a function to get an access token, and all you're doing is passing in your client ID, your client secret, your tenant ID, and then your refresh token as well too. And then the scope again is Graph API. And this is basically then giving you that access token in the response. So it's an easy way to constantly get a new access token. You could put this into the headers of certain scripts that you run, and you just have to dynamically be passing in those values as well too. So if the script has access to a refresh token, that could be something that you dynamically pass in. Again, we want this to be headless for the automations that we're trying to create, but we could also be using this for just running Graph APIs on demand as well too, like this license report. Maybe you just want to see it on demand, for instance. Okay, so now let's go ahead and grab or call Microsoft Graph API with our access token that we have here. Again, if I go ahead and access this variable, we have it already accessible here. So we just need to define our headers, and I have that in a sample script online as well from what I've left in here. So this is kind of dissecting this script a little bit, but what we want to call in here is making sure we pass in this access token and modifying our headers so that it's in the proper format as well for what we need. So that's a very important aspect about this as well. So if I say that, now I say headers, then I can see that we have our authorization value as that bearer token. So from here, I can go ahead and run basically just a custom script as well too. So we're going to use invoke REST method. The method is going to be get. The URI is going to be, let's put this in quotations here. We're going to use the user's endpoint here. And let me just reference the documentation to make sure this is correct. Oh yeah, the only thing we need to do here is grab this v1 as well. So let's go back to our PowerShell script here. We'll just put in v1.0 and then users. And then for the header parameter, we're going to pass in our headers. And this should work here. We should be able to get our users within the tenant. So we did here one thing now, we just have this in this separated value. So if you wanted to kind of wrap this up, we could say users, or I should say, let's go ahead and pass in what we had before. Just going to make a variable called users, and then we're going to put this in parentheses, and then we're going to say dot value. And now if I call users, I get a list of objects, which is all the users in my tenant. And this is calling Graph API, so then you can manipulate through this as well too, but that's everything we had to do in order to grab those authentication headers and basically leverage our access token here. So again, we weren't signing into PowerShell, we were just using the token that we already had as well too. So hope this was helpful, hope it made sense. This is everything you would need to be able to call Microsoft Graph APIs in your tenants. Just a quick call out, I do make a note that if you're looking to do this across all of your customers in Partner Center as a multi-tenant level access point or grabbing access tokens across your customer tenants, you do need to follow this article here, which is fully supportive of GDAP as well. So list any comments or questions below on the video that you had. Otherwise, like and subscribe if you guys want to see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space. Thanks guys, have a great day.